Hey everyone, back again. Today I'm starting something new, and admittedly something I'm not super excited about. But this is a text I got my students to read, and at this time I can only really cover things that I'm teaching in class. So I'm going to be covering Rosemary Salomone's The Rise of English. Now, this book offers a lot. I really dislike the way that Salomone interprets the phenomenon that she's describing. So I'm going to take most of what she says and I'm going to apply my own spin to it because obviously I'm extremely biased and I cannot tolerate the way in which she describes colonialism and the rise of English just so flippantly without, almost reducing it at times to being like good for business. It's like, wow. Anyways, so I'm going to talk about this book and I can't bring myself to spread this out over 3 episodes, even though the amount of information I'm going to cover would normally be about 3 of my episodes, but I can't bring myself to do that. So I'm going to have 2 longer episodes for this book and just blast through it. I know it's not a great start for the thing you're about to tune into for your host to be like not super thrilled about it, but I assure you, a lot of the information is very valuable. And I hope I'm able to make it relevant to you and to really stress the importance of this topic, even if I don't think the author does so in a way that I would appreciate. But yeah, before jumping into it, I know, long intro. For those of you that are new here, hi, I'm David. I explain philosophical texts and ideas and ways to make them accessible to you so you can tune in every few weeks. Every couple of weeks is pretty much my schedule now. If you want, you can subscribe and then see videos I release every couple of weeks. Or if you found this on YouTube, you can find it as a podcast wherever you find podcasts where there shouldn't be any ads, which is like a constant problem I'm dealing with. But there shouldn't be any ads. And yeah, then you can just listen to it. It'll be a great time. If you want to help me out, you can like, share, subscribe. That would be great. Tell your friends. They might get a kick out of it. If you want to help me out monetarily, don't. Consider instead donating to one of the organizations below, helping people in Gaza and Lebanon from Israeli aggression and genocide. So, consider doing that, please. The people there really, really need all the help that they can get. And yeah, so let's jump into Rosemary Salomone's The Rise of English. Today we're going to cover up to part 2, which is titled The New Scramble for Africa. We're going to get up to there and then we'll pick up from there for the next episode. So this starts out with an introduction, like so many books, called The English Divide. Now it begins by reflecting on Marquis de Condorcet's criticism of the monopoly Latin held in the 18th century over science and the arts. Now Latin was kind of the lingua franca. Lingua franca is a fancy term for common tongue among the high arts, among the sciences, if you were going to enter into these fields at the highest echelons of academic book learning, then you'd have to know Latin. This was common all throughout Europe for the 16th, 17th centuries and earlier. Now, Marquis de Condorcet was no fan of this. He advocated instead vernacular languages. So vernacular languages happens to coincide with the advent of the nation state. So instead of people speaking Latin as a sign of highfalutin technical language, people would start to speak local dialects that would actually come to be part of the national fabric. And it was at this time, in the 17th and 18th centuries, when people stopped speaking really like either local languages or highfalutin type Latin, and instead started to speak national languages. Hence, the emergence of things of languages like German, like French, like English, where suddenly people in large territories who were now clumped or placed under a national umbrella, many of whom didn't actually know what was going on. They were just in their little town, and then all of a sudden they're being told that they're German or French or whatever, and they're like, what does that mean? And there's a long history here. I mean, in France, in all these places, even after the nation state emerged, if you went from town to town, from village to village, people didn't speak the same language. Yet there was this, with the rise of industrialization, with the rise of communication technologies, with the rise of the railroad, with the rise of other modes of transport, suddenly people within national boundaries, within borders, started to adopt the same language, hence the rise of vernacular languages. And these vernacular languages began to oppose the monopoly that Latin held over higher learning. So one great example is Dante's Inferno by Dante Alighieri, where in Dante's Inferno, the Divine Comedy, Dante's Inferno, the Divine Comedy, it was written in Italian. It was written in a specific dialect of Italian that would come to stand in for, the rest of Italian, more or less. But in any case, this is one example of the opposition to Latin. It was kind of a radical move. I mean, if we take radical in the most defanged way, it was quite radical for Dante to write this book, this poem, in his own language. That was seen as you're fighting the man by doing that. So in some ways, today, English has replaced Latin. And that's pretty much what this book is about, is the way in which English has become the lingua franca, the common tongue of higher learning, of business, of tech, of transport. English is a necessary language. If you're a pilot, you have to know English. No matter where you are in the world, you have to know call signs in English. If you're a coder, you have to learn English because coding is done in English. If you are going to be a college, a global college, chances are your success is going to hinge on how many of your programs are offered in English. It is the language of world trade. It is the language of NATO, among other languages, but it has the most prominent place. It is the language of the International Criminal Court, and so on. And this isn't necessarily a good thing, as Salomone will come to show, for even English speakers, because there are problems with monolingualism, obviously, given that there are other languages on Earth. And English speakers, according to Salomone, and this requires a lot more nuance than I think Salomone gives it, she wants to claim as though there's this fundamental hindrance to being monolingual or just learning the English language. And it's like, yeah, okay, but tiniest violin, right? I mean, these are the people who are colonizing the world with their culture industry. They are getting away with it quite easily. I hardly would think about painting them as victims here, but there are problems with it. Did I ever sound like a Canadian before? Now, of course, there are going to be issues. We're going to go through it, all of that. Now, English is much worse than Latin because this is a global phenomenon. It isn't just Latin that's confined to Europe. The rise of English has so many effects, such a large effect globally, that it threatens even national identities. Where national identities and vernacular languages actually uprooted Latin, what we are seeing now is the new Latin, that is English, coming to undo these vernacular languages in favor of this one language. Now, we can't ignore the histories of colonialism, where the British held upwards of 90% of the Earth's surface at some point. So English has its roots. The English have laid down their roots all across the planet, which has resulted in so many people on Earth speaking English or being aware of English, knowing how to at least understand it. And these effects are, we're really feeling these effects. And in the most abstract way, I mean, the idea of a single world language really troubles me. And I'm totally divorcing this from considerations of the violence of erasing other languages just for a moment, because it's which is a pretty violent thing to do, but I hope you can tolerate what I'm doing. The idea of the world being subsumed into a single world language really concerns me, because it implies just one single worldview. Now, if any of you know many languages, you know that there are things within each language that are not translatable to other languages. There are just things that are unique to certain languages. And all of that will go away. And all of the ways to understand the world that are filtered through specific languages will disappear. Hence, entire worldviews will disappear if there's a single overarching global language, which does seem to be the direction we're heading in. Now, I don't want to be too doom and gloom about it because it's not, set in stone, but it's kind of a thing. Now, in the context of colonialism, which is really, much bigger concern, in the systematic erasure of indigenous languages, one of the ways that manifests today in quote-unquote post-colonial contexts is that indigenous-speaking people, or people who speak indigenous languages, especially in North America, whether it's Navajo or Dene or Cree or whatever, speaking any of these languages, in order for them to actually be recognized as indigenous people, they need to write grant proposals and perform politics in English or in French in Canada in some contexts, which shows the extent to which that people previously colonized and currently sitting in the residual trauma and violence of colonialism as it maintains itself in this quote-unquote post-colonial context, how these people are forced to adopt colonial languages just to attain the bare minimum. And this is a global phenomenon where people all across the planet are placed under a kind of obligation to learn English to be competitive industrially, financially, politically, and so on. And people who resist that are branded as rogue states, or they're seen as these pariahs needing to have freedom brought to them through bombs and democracy and those things. So to understand the rise of English, Salomone points to 4 different things. That is, things that we have to consider. 3. We have to consider globalization, which refers to trade and information technology. We have to look at internationalization, which is the institutional responses to globalization. And she's going to focus on this a lot in terms of higher education, how higher ed, colleges and universities all across the world have taken on this logic of internationalization to adapt to a globalized English world. And then we also have to think about the knowledgeization-based economy, that is value placed on languages and knowledge related to those languages in an industrial sense, and how so many people, in order to be competitive economic agents in this world, need to know English. And I find, as a kind of side point, in so many considerations about oppression and power, I really find that consideration of linguistic oppression doesn't get as much consideration as it should, because it is both the sign of previous and current oppression, and it is such a pernicious tool to enact or to erase worldviews by imposing languages on others, and it often goes ignored. So, for example, if you look at in the case of Gaza, where so many reporters on the ground, if they haven't been murdered by the Israeli apartheid regime, so many people there are forced to make TikToks and Instagram reels and stuff in English to just appeal to the sympathies of English people, which of course they have to do it. Of course they do. But it is a sign of the way in which English plays a global colonial role on the planet, to the point that people suffering the most brutal horrors have to adopt English, which isn't even their first language, just to be taken seriously. Our focus should be entirely on the Israeli apartheid regime, no doubt. But this is one of those elements here that, always kind of is a little bit concerning and kind of goes unexamined when we consider these colonial settings, like Israeli colonialism, for example. And the same in Israel, where Netanyahu does these speeches in English just to appeal to the English overlords. And indeed, they are overlords, linguistic overlords that often goes unexamined. And there's so many, language is so interesting. You have a total separate phenomenon in Israel, the anti-Yiddish sentiments of Zionism. One of the, it's a piece of evidence of how Zionism is really quite anti-Semitic, in that it imposed Hebrew, which was not a spoken language among Jews, especially all those Jews that were concentrated and then deported to Mandate Palestine. What came with that was an intense anti-Yiddish sentiment, where these Jews who spoke Yiddish were associated with the East, associated with the Orient, quote unquote, not part of the civilizing project, quote unquote, civilizing project of Zionism in that part of the world. So they adopted this very technical, almost artificial language, Hebrew, that, it was rabbinical. Rabbis were using this language to communicate with one another and to, talk about Torah and all that. In any case, language is super interesting, and there are reasons colonizers go after languages. Now, to go back, because obviously I've digressed, these three things, we have globalization, we have internationalization, and then we have knowledgeification of all this stuff. These happen to really coincide with the logics of neoliberalism and the broader trend of 20th century capitalism to really go after global markets and to expand itself to pretty much anywhere it desires. So no more respect of borders or international law. I mean, who cares about all of that? That all goes out the window. And instead, what we have is just endless consumption, endless exploitation, endless extraction of resources. And the same applies against labor. And when you have people laboring, it helps when they speak the language that the managers and the overlords speak. And so there is this kind of perpetual pressure for people to adopt English. And it is a valuable commodity. And all the more so if one is fluent in English. And there are more non-native English speakers than native ones. That is, there are more people on this earth who've adopted English as a second language than there are people who speak English as their first language. It has come to represent modernity, cosmopolitanism, technological progress, and as we will see very perniciously, it has come to be associated, that is English, has come to be associated with anti-colonialism, especially in those contexts, especially in those places that were colonized by the French and the Dutch. So we're going to look at Rwanda, we're going to look at South Africa, Algeria. In these contexts, English has been taken up as a way to oppose those histories of French colonialism, but it's just adopting one colonial language for another. Not to place the blame on the people adopting it, but it is one of those examples of how language is a site for colonial oppression. So English is found, it's ubiquitous. It's found everywhere. 60% of internet content, and this is a few years ago, she was writing this in just 2021, 60% of internet content is in English. Of the thousands of languages on the Earth's surface, 60% of internet content in English. Wild. Now, English speakers corner themselves, though, and this is, again, tiniest violin. English speakers corner themselves by refusing to learn another language and therefore another worldview. Where most people on Earth are multilingual, they speak more than one language. It's a very common thing across most of the planet to be around other people and other cultures and to therefore adopt other languages. Colonizers tend not to. The colonizers are very historical colonizers, the French, the English, they're very stubborn. They hate learning other languages. I don't mean to generalize, but I will generalize a little bit. They don't really learn other languages all that much. Oh, but I did. David, I learned another language. Good for you. That's great. Amazing. And that puts us here into chapter 2, titled Myth or Reality. Now, she begins here by reflecting on a French film called Auberge Espagnole, which translates in... what's the English translation? It's always a bit of a dangerous game to try to translate movie and book titles, because often the translation is different. It's the Auberge Espagnole is the Spanish Inn, maybe. I don't know if that's the actual title. You'd think that'd be a thing I'd look up. But it's a story about a Parisian student studying in Barcelona. There, he's forced to live among other students, and it's like a kind of melting pot. Is that the way to describe it? There's a bunch of people from all over the world at this Spanish inn, and they're from different backgrounds, and they expose him to the multilingual face of Europe. And him being a Parisian, French Parisians think that Paris is the center of the world. Again, I'm generalizing. Please don't hate me. Center of the world, and they just learn their French, and that's it. It's like, why would you go look everywhere else? Paris is the hotbed of science and culture and literature and art and all that. What else is there to get from the world? Now, this story seeks to undo that, where you have this Parisian student, he's encountering all these other languages and cultures, and he's having this moment where he's like, oh, well, or this whole book where he's opening himself up to otherness. Now, with the rise of English, we have to ask if a story like this is different, would be different today, or if a story like this would really be the same. And in what ways are stories like this, do they tokenize this very act of learning other languages? And this isn't something that Salomone really considers, but I think in an age where linguistic colonialism has become so widespread, this idea about multilingualism is offered as a kind of romantic alternative and mode of quote-unquote resistance, but it often translates to people just learning other colonial languages. And it's like, oh, wow, look at how amazing and progressive we are in learning many colonial languages. It's like, why don't you learn, I don't know, Cree, Tongva, or, any other language that's not a colonial language? And as the conclusion of this book will say, because it just kind of blankly points to this romanticized idea about the value of multilingualism, I'm like, okay, well, what do you mean? Like multilingualism in terms of adopting like another European language or like another major worldly dominant language? Like, bravo. You've really done wonders here. Now, all across Europe, all across the world, leaders of countries are really expected to know English. Many of them give speeches in English. Many of them demonstrate at least some knowledge of English. There are exceptions. I mean, there's Modi in India who has to some extent opposed English. He's also cozied up to it a little bit. And it's interesting to see how many of those populist, extremely nationalist, isolationist countries are still willing to adopt English to pander to American interests while screaming about the horrors of like external influence. And it's interesting to see how that narrative kind of slips away when English can be adopted for like economic ends, for example. Isn't that, a kind of foreign influence that's disrupting the fabric of that country? Interesting. Now, in most of these cases, obviously, like every one of these countries, they still possess their own language and are expected to protect it from exterior influence, especially when that influence is non-European immigration. Then suddenly there's a serious concern for the purity of the language and the culture being under threat. And this is especially true in Europe. You see this similar kind of rhetoric in India and Australia and other places and it's generally directed against Muslim people and Muslim countries, where, they're painted as this ultimate threat to national sovereignty and to the national culture and the fabric of the national identity and so on. And within Europe, though, I mean, the irony is that Europe, in its like governing EU ways, tries to at least outwardly express the importance of diversity and unity. So the EU is this amalgamation of different European countries, Germany and France and whatever, all these countries that all speak different languages, that all have different national identities, ostensibly. And so it is able to say, look, we love diversity. But in that is what they're doing is disavowing or words are hard today. What they are doing is providing the illusion that there is diversity, even though this diversity is measured purely by the number of European differences that are offered at the EU or the ICC or NATO beyond the EU. In any case, so they try to provide this veneer of a kind of unity in diversity. But when does that narrative end? Well, when it's Muslim immigration, or when it's immigration from African nations, for example. Then suddenly this love of unity and diversity fades away. But even within this European context, where there's this adornment of all these European languages, there's still a hierarchy. And that is that English still plays a central role. And the hierarchy goes like this. I mean, overall, among all these countries, you have English at the top, then you have the national language, and then you have all the other languages that are neither English nor the national language that many, many, many people speak that aren't given the same kind of credit or due or importance. And, you can just tell how linguistic colonialism and power is playing out because it's the language that so many people speak. That is, so many people in positions of authority, at least at some point, will give some kind of speech in English. But you don't see that. When will you see the President of the United States give a speech in French? And this is another colonial language. And at the EU, at the ICC and stuff, like, they're all documents and stuff are delivered in English. They're made sure to be offered by default in English. If it is going to be done in another language, it has to be translated, which is it's just so much evidence of the power that English holds over the world. Now, the EU does recognize other languages. At the time of writing this, I mean, the numbers might be a little different now, but a few years ago, the EU recognized 24 of approximately 60 regional or minority languages and more than 175 migrant languages. But this logic of, or this practice of recognition to recognize these languages, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean? Are they going to be offering services and documents in those languages? Maybe. Or is it just like, oh, we acknowledge that they exist? Which, very different things. So most documents are written and distributed in French and English, at the ICC and EU and stuff. Today, about 80% of documents are written in English first. And this wasn't always the case, because in the EU and in the International Criminal Court, its history, I would say, was more slanted towards French. And French has kind of lost its grip over these institutions. Now, as English began to rise, the French feared that the EU would no longer be European, with English's association with America, where the French were like, oh, we can't allow the EU and all these other institutions to become primarily English because English is a global language. Of course, in saying that, they're totally erasing the history of French colonialism, where French is spoken throughout much of Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the Americas, so much French everywhere. But they weren't concerned about that, like how adopting French among these institutions would be like a sign of a global influence now playing a part in European politics. And France was feeling this not only at the European institutional level, but at the national level, where in 1994, France adopted La Loi Toubon, which mandated the use of French in certain public areas and arenas. This is the Toubon Law, and it was like an effort to protect the French language. In Quebec, in Canada, there's a similar law. It's called Loi 101, which is Law 101, Bill 101, Law 101, that protects the French language and places certain restrictions on how English can be presented in public spaces and how businesses have to conduct their business in certain languages. And these are efforts by these countries to protect their language from English influence mostly. And it's really interesting because, it's this effort to reclaim this language, especially in French. It's incredibly interesting. It's incredibly ironic because the French have had no problem historically spreading their language through genocide and colonialism and enslavement. They've had no historical problem doing that. But then suddenly, when it applies to them, they have the institutional and authoritative support to be able to put in laws protecting their language. Would they have supported Algeria putting in laws to protect local languages from the influence of French? I wonder if the French would have been like, oh yeah, we respect that. Yeah, cool. Now, I mean, with all of this, there's so many different debates going on. Salomone goes through these different debates, who's arguing what. Some people thinking that English is always a sign of colonialism and therefore should be challenged, and then she platforms people who think that, oh, well, that'd be like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We have to recognize English's place. It's great for the economy after all. This is why you learn English. It's good for money. This is why you should become multilingual. It's good for money. Because apparently these are opinions we should take seriously. And it's interesting, though, to see how this kind of conversation is framed, in that it's like you have, on the one hand, this effort to find the value in histories of colonialism, and on the other hand, placing such an opinion in distinction to, efforts to decolonize, as though these are two on the same footing, as though they're on the same level. Now, the EU and other organizations have emphasized the importance of multilingualism. How much their multilingualism is just trying to organize places to speak two European languages, I mean, that seems to be the focus, while claiming to be unique, or claiming to be, representing people in their specificities. But despite these efforts, I mean, it's really difficult to combat the English culture industry, how the effects of Hollywood and American militarism, colonialism, have really spread English all across the planet and make it really challenging to oppose that influence of English. And there are these efforts to turn more isolationist and nationalist in response to this rise of English, because people want to protect their local languages. They want to protect their national heritage. They want to protect these things from Hollywood, from English. And then Salomone jumps on the traditional kind of academic speak of being just always opposed to nationalism, as I am as well. But it's just done in such a way that's so uncritical here, where it's like, of course, nationalism bad. And it's like, whoa. I mean, wait a second. Are these people doing this because the alternative is English influence and American influence of setting up military bases in these countries, and having a strong military presence and putting rockets up to their borders? Are we talking nationalism is the same no matter what? I think it's important to qualify this. But in any case, moving on to chapter 3, a high stakes moment. Now, for the last few decades, many countries adopted English in higher education to attract international students who might otherwise not be incentivized to go somewhere where the national language isn't their own. Now, this is, at the end of the day, this is kind of hurting everybody. So, for some examples, the most obvious ones are the adoption of English in the Nordic countries. So, Sweden and Finland and Denmark, they offer so many programs, college programs, university programs in English. Same with the Netherlands. Now, English instruction has been on the rise over the last 20 years, with an increase upwards of 50% of college programs offered in the Netherlands, Germany, and Nordic countries being offered in English, and even in France. Now, Brexit exacerbated this because many people didn't feel comfortable going to Britain to learn English, given that Brexit was a largely a nationalist, a racist effort to protect Britain's borders, that kind of a thing. Many people who felt indeed it was a racist thing weren't comfortable going to Britain to learn English, and instead were well, where else can I go to learn English? Because we have to learn English because it's good for money, good for politics, yada yada yada. And they would go to other places. So Italy, France, Germany, the Nordic countries all opened their doors and actually opened up new programs offered in English to attract these people. Now, at a more local level in terms of colleges have been, what they've been doing in adopting more English programs is that they have been listening to the calls of globalization by internationalizing. Now, internationalizing is just keyword for becoming more English. And now, through various policies highlighting the need for colleges to adopt this internationalization in response to globalization, college administration have encouraged all throughout Europe over the last 20 years, have encouraged professors and other academics to change teaching structures, to offer different ideas about the role of languages, offer career paths, guidance for prospective students, strategic partnerships, and so on. And this is just one example of the way in which higher education is becoming more and more about profit and less about learning. It's like there's a part of me that really thinks that the general sentiment among administrators across the world in colleges is that they want colleges to be turned into business schools and sports stadiums. That seems to be what the end goal is in a lot of cases. I remember at one of the last schools I was at, they transformed their library essentially into one big Starbucks. They're like, what are we going to do with all these pesky books? Wouldn't instead of having these pesky books here, we just had cafes everywhere? Wouldn't that be great? I'm exaggerating, but I'm not exaggerating that much. Now, did they do these things? Like, did colleges change curricula? Did they change administrative and pedagogical methods to adopt to globalization and the rise of English? Not exactly. In a lot of cases, all they did, and this is like really messed up, is they just adopted English. They didn't offer like actual strategic changes because that would actually require more money. They were just like, actually what we can do is let's just force so many of our profs to give courses in English, and so we can say that we offer programs in English. And that's because, they started to adopt English as just the panacea, just like the cure-all of all the problems. They're like, well, all people really want is to learn English. Let's just offer programs in English. And it kind of makes sense, because if you look at the international rankings by like the Times Higher Ed of colleges, is that so many of their criteria center English. They don't come out and say this, but some of their criteria include educational experience for students. Well, if courses and programs are offered in the hegemonically dominant, it's redundant, I know, dominant language on the earth that gives you a leg up in terms of student experience. Colleges are also measured by their research output. Research that's written in English is likelier to be read globally. If you just write research in Italian, only Italians are going to be able to read it. So many about like collaboration and all this stuff essentially just gives a leg up to institutions that operate in English. And one of the ways this is going to be a reckoning for many English-speaking languages, English-speaking colleges all across the world, is that as more and more colleges start to adopt English as their primary language all across the world, it's going to reveal how mediocre those quote-unquote Ivy League colleges have really been historically, and that have really held a lot of their power and their influence and reputation, not necessarily because of the quality of the education that they provide, but because they are these shining beacons of English exceptionalism on earth. And as that begins to go away, and they no longer hold this monopoly of being like these higher ed English schools, I think we're going to see like a real reckoning about which institutions offer students actual meaningful educations. I'm being very optimistic. I think before then we're just going to see the corporatization of colleges, but in any case, dare to dream. Now, of course, we've seen this across all disciplines, but especially in the sciences where people are expected to publish in English. And when they have to use new terms, which they often do, they are often only in English. And a lot of the times, they don't even have a translation in the original language of many of the people who might be doing that research. So they just use these terms in English. And this is the nature of Anglocentrism on a global level. And it has real effects. It means that so many different countries are going to be alienated from their own histories and we'll look at it a bit in terms of Italy, but Italian architecture is now done a lot of the time in English. People study it in English, which is just erasing that rich history of Italian architecture for hundreds of years before this rise of English. And this plays out in so many other cases too. Like there's a prof at the University of Ottawa who I'm hoping to have on the shows in a few months. We're going to talk about his new book. Probably we'll be doing an episode in French with him. So that'll be interesting. I hope I'm able to do it well. But he's written a lot. His name is Alexandre Barry. He's written a lot about the within feminism and gender studies, how the monopoly that English holds has created this kind of like echo chamber of feminist knowledge within English academic circles. He also writes about the way that there is a kind of resistance among the French in that context to adopt a lot of the English terminology, because I mean French has and Spanish too have fundamental barriers when it comes to the most cutting edge gender studies stuff, because I mean at their most basic level they gender nouns. They reduce the world to masculine or feminine. La table, it's like, what? Feminine table, what does that mean? And so there are some barriers presented there in translating across these languages. But I digress. Now, English is just offered, as I said before, as this cure-all for all of the problems of globalization. It doesn't, these colleges aren't necessarily offering other things to students other than just learning English. And there's a similar thing. I covered Ngugi Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind a few weeks ago, and he writes about the same thing in Kenya, how people in Kenya, after English colonialism, and after the Kenyan government mandated all students learn English, students that would succeed weren't the smartest. They didn't do best on their tests in math and science and English and whatever, but they're the students who actually just spoke English best as a sign of Anglo privilege. All you have to do is speak English well, and you're going to do great. So as the Elon Musks and others in the world lose their minds about DEI and about affirmative action and all of that, it's interesting to see how they don't care about any of that when it comes to people earning high-paying positions just because they speak English. They're not the most qualified. They're not the smartest. They're probably not even the best. They might not even be the best at English, but they demonstrate a proficiency and a fluency in the language that has value in itself. Now, many of these schools promise English proficiency, but we must also ask what kind of English are they talking about? Because no language is a homogeneous, universal thing. There's not like one univocal, single expression of English. English, you go from region to region, it's going to sound different, people use different words, and so on. Now, she draws here from Baj Katru's 3 concentric circle maps, whereas there's like an inner circle, there's a middle circle, and then an exterior circle, where the inner circle is norm setting. Now you have Britain, Canada, the US in terms of what countries are establishing norms for that language. The middle circle refers to norm developing, and these refer to colonized nations pretty much that have adopted the colonial language. Then you have the outer circle that are norm dependent, that have their own language and their own autonomy, but adopt English or adopt another language quite commonly. So Germany, France, the Netherlands, where people learn English, not really in France, but in Germany, the Netherlands, people I think it's mandated all across the Netherlands that everyone learns English, like in elementary school. And I remember I was in the Netherlands about 10 years ago, and I was asking someone about it because I was looking at a movie theater. I was just looking at the posters on it, and I was like, why are they playing all these movies in English? And I asked someone, and they're like, yeah, we don't translate films like that. Everyone just knows English, so we just play movies in English. I thought that was interesting. There might be I might be wrong. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what someone told me. But the kind of English that's being represented among these institutions isn't indicative or representative of most English speakers. It's just a certain kind of highfalutin type English. In those cases where you actually have fluent English speakers teaching classes, Because another problem that we'll talk about, I think, I don't think we'll get into it in more detail. But so one of the problems that these colleges confronted was that many of their faculty didn't speak English. And they would try to incentivize them to take night classes, learn English really quickly so that they could offer these programs in English. But that meant that students would actually have a rougher time because these people didn't know English. It's ridiculous that they were expected to learn it and then to teach in that language, because it's really hard to teach in a language that's not your own. And it just presented all of these issues, but those issues didn't matter because the school could say, oh, we're offering these programs in English. Oh, this is great for international rankings. Now, in the past, one's success in academia was dependent upon their publishing. How much did you publish? And a common phrase in academia is publish or perish. But really, that's not the case anymore. Because if you published in your own language, chances are you'd still perish. Now it's you must publish in English or perish, which essentially discriminates. Of course, it discriminates against non-English speakers, even other European colonizers. Even they are suffering because of this. Now imagine the actual people who are suffering. It has extreme effects. And they often need to pay a lot, people who don't write in English, who need to publish in English, they often have to pay a lot in order to have their stuff translated into English so that they can be competitive on the English market. And that puts us here into chapter 4, Shakespeare in the Crossfire, where this is the battle between France and English, where you have the French being our cultural icon, our playwright, our famous person is Molière, and the English have Shakespeare. So this is a battle between Shakespeare and Molière, and each place has its own, then you have Dante somewhere else, and so on. So in 2013, France backpedaled some of the stricter stipulations in its 1994 Toubon law, la loi Toubon that I mentioned earlier. So 2013, it was revisiting this. Now in contrast, Italy struck down a college's plan to switch entirely to English for grad programs in 2014. So France was essentially this Toubon law is pretty important for us. It's pretty good to help protect French, but we really love the money that, allowing students to do English programs at our colleges, it brings in a lot of money for international students and raises the quality and the value of our education according to this Times Higher Ed rankings or anything like that. And so they're we can maybe dial back this Toubon law a little bit. Meanwhile, in Italy, they were actually we need to do more to protect Italian because, Italy also doesn't have the same kind of colonial history as the French. It does, obviously. I mean, Ethiopia, I'm not denying that. And there aren't many places outside of Italy that really speak Italian in a lot of detail. There's diaspora and there's communities all throughout America and Canada and all around. I'm not saying that, but that where it's a national language, you don't see a whole lot of that. And so the Italians really feel this need to protect their language. This doesn't exist much anywhere else. So in 2014, colleges within Italy were trying to adopt more English programs, and the Italian government was no, you can't. We are not doing this. Now, the 2013 changes, this was happening in kind of 2013, 2014 in Italy, came with what were called the Fiorasso's Law that wanted France to be more competitive in the international student market. Did I say Italy? No, I meant France. Well, in any case, these things were making these changes in the early 2010s in France and Italy, which we will talk about. Now, obviously, in the French context, many people resisted this for what it would do to French and really to France in total. So people were also concerned that it would affect education by putting more value in English than what students were actually learning, which is a consistent problem where it's just the value is found in English alone, not in what you're learning in that language. Now, faculty also worried that they would be replaced with Anglophones or people who spoke English, even if they weren't quite as qualified. Just if they spoke English, that would be enough for them to get hired. And it was, of course, the irony here is that France was one of the world's most violent colonial perpetrators. in history, and suddenly they're so scared about their language dying. But English influence in France is undeniable. Like it has real effects with many popular terms like shopping, parking, coming right from English. And there are a lot of differences between French spoken in Quebec versus France. In France, they seem a little bit more willing to just like adopt English words like email, which is an English word. In Quebec, they use the term courriel, which is like an older French word that they've reappropriated for that context. In France, they say shopping, they say weekend. They use English words, and people feel this influence of English that they don't seem to be guarding themselves against all that much. Now in Italy, we have a different story, because there isn't the same kind of sociocultural association or language with national identity. Where in France, it's mandated by law that French is the official language, and Italy has its own history with fascism, of course, under Mussolini, that it has since tried to move away from. So part of this is that Italy doesn't really have the same kind of protective language laws, partly because after the fascist government in the mid 20th century, they were like, oh, these kind of restrictive laws don't really look good, so let's not adopt these types of things. Now, many controversies emerged as a result, because Italy doesn't have these kind of consecrated laws to protect the Italian language in the ways that like France does with French. And so a big controversy arose when Milan's Technical Institute, essentially their equivalent of MIT, proposed offering its grad courses exclusively in English. This is the early 2010s. And the school had been offering some courses in English, as many colleges have for a long time, but it was quite popular. But the school quickly noticed that non-Italian students would almost never enroll in classes in Italian. So students would just show up and do their courses in English and not do courses in Italian. And so it spent like millions of dollars training its faculty and staff to learn English. It also mandated non-Italian students to take Italian language, culture, and courses, which is like at the very bare minimum. I mean, if you're going to offer your program, school programs in English in Italy or France or whatever, it makes sense that you would also offer like mandatory courses in your language as an effort to protect that language. Of course, not everyone was on board for many of the same reasons as in France. I mean, they're scared of English influence. Additionally, many classic Italian texts on architecture haven't been translated to English. So when people show up and they just to Italy and just take classes in English and never bother to learn Italian, like they take architecture classes, for example, they won't actually learn about the rich history of Italian architecture in the Italian language. Now, the courts more or less, like they oppose the Institute's plan to offer programs entirely in English, saying that it gave too much power to English. The proposal would restrict freedom to speak and teach in Italian for faculty. So there's a lot of nitty-gritty around the laws at the time. Essentially what the laws said is that people should be free to teach in the language of their choice. And so in the courts, people argued that it was going to take away Italian speakers' rights to teach in their own language. Now, the school appealed the decision. The school was like, well, we have our right to teach in whatever language we want. And so the school appealed the decision, and the next year offered 24 of its 28 courses in English, 8 of which it also, so there were two sections of each course. There was the English one and the Italian one. Offered 8 of the 24 were also offered in Italian. And since then, since about 2013, English courses have been on the rise across Italy. And that puts us into chapter 5, Headwinds from the North. Compared to the Netherlands, the debates and decisions that have circulated in France and Italy barely compare. The Netherlands is a completely other different beast. And this is largely due to the Dutch's willingness to adopt English for pragmatic reasons. And the Dutch have long mandated that children learn English. They have a very different relationship with English. But now they're starting to feel, they're like, oh, maybe this is a little too much English around here. Where by 2017, almost 100% of Dutch students were learning English. Now in higher education, the Dutch lead the way in English instruction among non-English countries. That is, of course, they don't compete with like the US or Britain or whatever. But among non-English first language countries, they lead the way across Europe. Unlike France and Italy, the Netherlands does not really enshrine Dutch as the only language. In 1992, Parliament decided it was ultimately up to colleges to decide what language they teach in, albeit with some effort to preserve Dutch, as you probably hear the college's bells in the background every 15 minutes as I record this. If you hear those gentle bells, I hope that they're nice in your ears. Now in 2014, a group of profs penned an open letter, criticizing the preference given to English in Dutch higher ed. Many of them were like, well, shouldn't we be teaching in our own language? Wouldn't that make sense? And their concern got a new conversation about English's influence essentially going in the Netherlands. And as it turns out, Dutch schools seem to have been loosely hiring English profs despite them often not being totally fluent in English, in Dutch, where they're just like, we just need English, doesn't matter. And like we saw in France and Italy, people argued on both sides, where some thought it was totally necessary to adopt English so that the schools can remain competitive on a global level, where others thought that adopting English would negatively affect Dutch and the Netherlands and so on. And so, there are these arguments going on. And as we see today, English has kind of won those debates. Now, in a specific effort to protect the Dutch language, the Dutch Association for Better Education took Maastricht University and University of Twente, God, I hope I pronounced these things right, to court for their unbridled internationalization practices. And I love the Netherlands. I think Utrecht is such a great little city. If you're listening and you're like, I'd love to go to the Netherlands, maybe not right now for a number of reasons, but if you ever want to go to the Netherlands, Amsterdam's cool. It's touristy. Go to one of the smaller towns. Go to Utrecht. You'll have a great time. It'll be, you'll see the canals. It's the same kind of thing, minus the tourists. You get the bikes everywhere. It's great. Learn some of the language. I mean, that'd be a great sign of respect. I think if we're going to go to places, it's a sign of respect and care to learn some of the language. Now, the court sided with the universities here, citing a 1992 law that universities can offer programs in English if there is enough of an international presence in English of that field. Now, despite losing in court, their concern forced people and institutions to begin taking the decline of Dutch seriously. And the government would quickly learn that many universities were offering programs in English illegally. Like they were just flying under the radar, offering these programs in English that didn't really catch the eye of the government. Now, of course, one of the risks in all of this is the reactionary turn to xenophobia and hatred of immigrants, which is often how these anxieties and fears manifest instead of manifesting against American influence, and again, sometimes it does, and English, because it's like in those cases, suddenly external influence is okay if it means more money for the people, if it does translate to that. Mostly it just means more money for the bankers, politicians, and so on, instead of the people. But there's some logic to that. In any case, yeah. So that'll push us into part 2, the new scramble for Africa, where we'll actually stop considering the effects of English on Europeans and considering it affects more globally. But yeah, we'll pick up on that next time. If there's anything I got wrong, anything I omitted, I'd love to hear about it. Let me know what you think. How do you see this concern playing out? Maybe you live in a country that's not English first language. I'd love to know how this affects you, if it does at all. And yeah, on that note, see you next time.